Good morning. My name is Isaura Rivera Nagnos. As a co-chair for the 5th Annual UCLA International Institute Graduate Students Conference, it has been a true pleasure to have worked with a renowned team of individuals in organizing a conference that foments the production of knowledge. Since universities seek to facilitate the development of new ideas, this student forum has come together to do just that. This year's conference, Going Global, Exploring Human Rights in the Shadow of Nationalism, was made possible thanks to a number of programs and institutions whom we would like to acknowledge at this time. This organizing committee for this conference includes Xu Ling, Sign Marketing Director, Taylor Shantz, Communications Director, and Matthew Albolino, Communication Director. The organizing committee worked diligently as a team to ensure its success in this conference. Thank you all for your hard work. We would also like to thank our sponsors. They are the UCLA International Institute, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the UCLA Graduate Division. Their support and contribution was invaluable, an invaluable asset for realization of this year's conference. Thank you for your support. Another important component of this 5th Annual UCLA International Institute Graduate Student Conference includes a team of people, the International Institute Academic Program staff, members whose work in the planning and preparation for this organization of the conference was a crucial component. Thank you, Magda Yamamoto. Sandy Valdivieso, and Erica Anjum. Their work was paramount in making this conference. Thank you. Now it is a great honor to introduce you Professor Christopher Erickson of the UCLA Anderson International Institute, Senior Associate Vice Provost and Director. Professor Erickson, welcome.
Well, welcome everybody. So on behalf of the International Institute, I'd like to welcome you here today. The International Institute at UCLA consists of 25-some research centers, sub-institutes, and programs, as well as 3 master's programs, 3 undergraduate IDP, and 2 freestanding minors. The International Institute serves to advance international studies, international and global studies at UCLA. We're delighted to have the opportunities to support and co-sponsor this fabulous conference, and our great thanks and congratulations to the organizing committee, to all of the staff involved, and to the students and everyone presenting today to this very interesting conference. It's also my honor to introduce our first speaker today, Professor Asli Bali, who's a professor of law at the UCLA Law School. She's also director of the UCLA Law School Promise Institute for Human Rights, and co-director of the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies, which is one of the International Institute centers. She currently teaches public international law, international human rights, a seminar on the laws of war, and a perspective seminar on the third world approaches to international law. Professor Bali is a graduate of Williams College, University of Cambridge, Yale Law School, and Princeton University, where she earned her PhD in politics. After law school, she worked for the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and also practiced law. She currently serves as co-chair of the advisory board for the Middle East Division of Human Rights Watch and is a national board member of the Middle East Studies Association. Professor Bali's principal scholarly interests lie in 2 areas: public international law, including human rights and the law of the International Security Order, and comparative constitutional law with a focus on the Middle East. Her current research examines questions of constitutional design in religiously divided societies. She's previously written on the nuclear non-proliferation regime, international legal arguments concerning humanitarian interventions, and the role of judicial independence in constitutional transactions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Asli Bali.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's really an honor to be able to address this group and to begin the discussions on this incredibly important topic today. I thought that what I would do in the short time I've been given, and I hope there's a timekeeper because it's hard to see that clock, is to give my sense of what the principal global challenges are that face the human rights system as a structural matter and how those intersect with the topic of the conference, the rise of nationalism, and what goes with it, the rise of populist authoritarianism. So let me begin first by addressing what I think are the structural factors that most challenge the current human rights order. The first is, over the course of the last 20 years or so, the rise of a counterterrorism paradigm that provides an alternative universal vocabulary of legitimacy, particularly in the hands of authoritarian actors that are now free to redescribe internal opponents and dissent, popular protest and journalism as acts of terrorism, and to suppress them in the name of a sort of legal framework that has been itself internationalized. So if the first challenge is the counterterrorism paradigm and the ways in which it fundamentally undermines the goal of human rights protections, the second has been the so-called migration crisis. The migration crisis, in my understanding, is not a crisis. It is a choice to reframe those who flee atrocity crimes and human rights violations around the world as a burdensome population to be excluded, rather than as the very targets of the protection regime that the human rights system once promised to be universal. The reason we have this crisis and the reason I describe it as structural is because the one incredibly important gap left in the protection regime that was created after the Second World War is the failure to recognize a right to entry, a right of free movement across international borders, which makes it fundamentally possible for governments to raise up walls, borders, fences, and extraterritorialize the warehousing of those who are fleeing persecution and violence. And if counterterrorism and this treatment of migration are two of the structural problems, the third and really central problem is the failure to mobilize political will to address atrocity crimes in our time. And these are, of course, tied, this structural flaw is tied to the previous two that I named, insofar as the promise of universal human rights protection, if it meant anything at all in the post-war order, was to say never again in the face of the atrocity crimes of the Second World War and in the face of the Holocaust. And instead, and we were told at that time, had we known, we might have acted. Had we known, we would have intervened. And today we know that atrocity crimes unfolding, including genocidal acts as defined by the United Nations system in places like Syria and Myanmar, are occurring live on television sets. Anyone can choose to click at a moment's notice on YouTube or elsewhere to see live streams of people being maimed and killed, children being burned and dismembered. And all of this has resulted in next to nothing in terms of a willingness politically to vindicate the basic promise of universal protection. Of course, that condition and that failure of mobilization of political will and the absence of an engine in the international system to require it then produces migration, which in turn produces strategies of exclusion, which produces narratives of external and internal threat, which produces the politics of counterterrorism, amongst many other things, which provides a language of legitimacy precisely for those exclusionary moves. In the face of all of this, which is a quite grim picture of a set of structural challenges embedded in the universal human rights system, we had one great promise in the last half century or so that emerged, which was the worldwide spread of democracy and the notion that democratic political systems could be harnessed to the promise of human rights, and democratic communities, democratic polities could be persuaded of the need both to honor that promise domestically through domestic civil rights and human rights protections, and to move in the direction of convergence across transnational boundaries against these kinds of crimes and recognizing a moral and political obligation to allow those into our communities who are fleeing those crimes. This fundamental potential dynamic of spreading democracy is itself now in recession. And this brings me to the topic of our conference today. It is described as a conference addressing human rights challenges in the shadow of nationalism. But nationalism alone does not describe or explain the challenge that we face with the kinds of phenomena that are currently identified primarily with nationalism, but that have really given rise to a new picture in which we have to confront the fundamental vulnerability of even relatively consolidated democracies to erosion, and erosion through the harnessing of the very technology of democratic governance itself. So let me turn for a moment to what I take to be the global playbook that has emerged that explains the rise not just of nationalism, but of populist authoritarianism across the international system. And this is a story of political entrepreneurs who have harnessed the politics of fear, trading on nationalism, but also trading on framings like migration as crisis, in order to transform fear into a powerful engine of exclusion and xenophobia that also pays enormous electoral dividends when they use this as part of their own campaigning in order to persuade a sector of a population, often not a majority, but a sufficient sector of a population to support them to enable them to gain office. Populism thrives on polarization, and what these entrepreneurs have specialized in is weaponizing divisions in a society, first to manufacture internal enemies, to identify a them within our borders that needs to be protected against, and then to identify those internal enemies with some form of external threat, whether it be human rights advocates calling for refugee protections against the threat of migration at the borders, as we've seen in the case of Hungary, which is on the verge today of passing an NGO law that would penalize NGOs specifically for advocacy around migration protections, or whether it be a free press that becomes the internal enemy that's aligned with treasonous outsiders that are seeking to undermine national security. The authoritarian playbook that draws on this script has become familiar across the international landscape, from Russia to Turkey, from the Philippines to Venezuela, and well beyond. And how does it work? How does democracy become the engine for fueling these incredibly anti-democratic and also human rights averse developments? Democracy is transformed in these contexts into bare majoritarianism. As I said, these political entrepreneurs are able to appeal to a particular segment of a society by persuading them that their circumstance is a consequence of actions by internal and external enemies that have privileged other interests and discriminated actively or disadvantaged the sector of the population now being mobilized around the nationalist or populist frame. Those who voted for the political entrepreneur are the insiders. They represent us, the true and authentic populace of the society in which they belong. And those who voted against are outsiders. The measures to disenfranchise those outsiders, to put them on the outside in the us and them paradigm within the country, take many forms. They include using counterterrorism paradigms, of course. So redescribing political opposition in ways that identifies dissent or organizing around opposition activities as national security threats or terrorism, and rewriting rules, particularly electoral rules, in order to turn a temporary majoritarian victory into a permanent structural consolidation of power by disenfranchising and excluding political opposition groups. This happens through an enormous array of different kinds of rule changes, all of which tend to be under the radar. So if democracy is thereby transformed into bare majoritarianism, the next move is centralizing power in the executive, rebalancing the power between the elected branches, between the executive and the legislature, with executives governing more and more increasingly through executive orders or executive decrees that enable them to bypass ordinary legislative checks, even in circumstances where they may not have a majority in the legislature but have been able to consolidate their control of the executive. There is also the strategy of empowering new executive authority to loyalists that are outside the ordinary chain, cronies, sons-in-law, whatever you might have that you might think of, individuals that are suddenly empowered with offices and titles and powers that are outside of the ordinary chain and who are being rewarded exclusively for their loyalty in an executive branch under increasingly centralized control. In tandem with this is the undermining of the independence of the judiciary. So you have the legislature basically losing power to some extent in a redressed balance in which executive orders serve in the place of ordinary legislation. The executive itself as a branch becomes a kind of bloated enterprise filled with loyalists and individuals not based on their qualifications. And the judiciary itself is called into question, both in terms of its authority and its independence. Efforts to pack the judiciary or alter its composition ensure that the judiciary, too, is made up of appropriate loyalists. All of this add up to a picture of structural transformation of institutions that serve as checks on the consolidation of power. And what we've seen over the last decade is that this can happen at an extraordinarily accelerated pace in a way that nobody would have anticipated, no constitutional law scholar would have suggested at the end of the 1990s. Now, some 2 decades on from that initial heyday of the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the post-war period, what we now see is a circumstance in which democracy has proven to be much more vulnerable to these strategies and much more vulnerable as a general matter in terms of its ability to maintain protections of core human rights domestically. These mechanisms to centralize power, to eliminate institutional checks internal to the government, then of course manifest through assaults on independence of the media, through the use of tax powers, libel laws, and also allegations of terrorism and treason, in order to shut whatever checks may exist in civil society or outside of the control of government, in order to silence too those potential breaks on authoritarian acceleration, authoritarian consolidation. Given that this is all driven by a use of a politics of fear that turns on the identification of internal opposition with alleged external enemies, it's easy to see why nationalism has become the currency of this particular trajectory. What I hope we're going to be able to do today over the course of the conference is really explore first the manifestations of the challenge that nationalism has come to pose to the human rights system, understanding again that what is now under assault is the one lever or engine that existed and was expanding transnationally in the international system that could have been the ongoing sort of driver of human rights protection, the thing that would enable us through the transformative power of domestic civil societies in democratic countries to honor that promise of universal protection that faces the structural challenges that I began with. The importance of rallying to the defense of a substantive conception of democracy against the kind of bare majoritarianism that enables the nationalist and populist turn, I think is urgent. And in order to be able to do that, one needs to understand the phenomenon at work. And that, I think, is the work of our conference today. And as a result, I view this conference both as an opportunity for expanding our scholarship in the area of human rights and as an opportunity to really think about how to connect scholarship to advocacy in order to meet the kinds of challenges I've tried to describe in these brief opening remarks. I look forward very much to the remainder of our day. Thank you.